What's up, y'all? Welcome back to another episode of AP Microeconomics Online with Mr. Seidel. Today we're looking at how to solve game theory FRQs. I'm talking about 4.5 oligopolies and how to solve these game theory matrices, okay? So, what you need to remember with game theory and oligopolies is that these two firms are interdependent on each other, right? Oligopolies are businesses that control a really large market but have very few firms. So we're talking usually less than 10 firms, but in these game theory problems, we'll only be looking at two firms, right? And so Apple and Samsung are our two firms that we're going to start by looking at, right? And these two firms are interdependent on each other. What does that mean? Well, when Apple has a sale, it affects Samsung. When Samsung has a new feature, it affects Apple, right? And so these firms, they're interdependent, and we can analyze their choices using game theory, right? Okay, so we have Samsung over here, and the first thing that I always do with these problems is I box out the leftmost firm, and the reason why I do that is because the leftmost firm represents the leftmost profit values. So I also put a box around the leftmost profit values. That way, I know whose profit is whose. If you want to maybe put a circle or underline Apple, you can, right? And then you could underline the rightmost numbers so that you remember that those profit numbers represent Apple, okay? And so Samsung and Apple, they have two choices. They can have high prices or they can have low prices. Now, one place that my students get confused is there's a lot of different numbers, there's a lot of different boxes, right? So it's kind of confusing to look at, right? Well, when Samsung goes high, that means that the only options are the topmost numbers, okay? So you can simplify it for yourself by covering up parts of boxes so that we can analyze these choices a little bit better, okay? When we are solving these problems, what we're looking for is a dominant strategy, and I'm going to show you what a dominant strategy is, right? So, if I want to analyze the dominant strategy for Samsung, I got to figure out what they're going to do when Apple sets their prices high and when Apple sets their prices low. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover up the rightmost side, and I'm going to force Apple to choose higher prices. Now, when Apple chooses higher prices, Samsung, do they want $100 of profit or do they want $50 of profit? Well, they're going to want $100 of profit. How do they get that? Well, if we look at that $100 of profit, that's on the top, right? That is on top. How does Samsung get to the topmost numbers? They get that by setting their prices high, right? And so when Apple goes high, Samsung will also go high, okay? Now, let's look at what will happen when Samsung goes low. Or excuse me, when Apple goes low. When Apple goes low, Samsung will want $60 of profit instead of $20 of profit. How do they get that? They get that by going high again, right? And so what we have here is we have what's called a dominant strategy. A dominant strategy is a strategy that one firm will do regardless of what the other firm will do, right? So we looked at Apple. When Apple went high, Samsung went high. And when Apple went low, Samsung still went high. That means no matter what happens, Samsung is going to set their prices high. That means that they have a dominant strategy, right? We can check to see if Apple has a dominant strategy. Sometimes one of them will have a dominant strategy. Sometimes both of them will have a dominant strategy. Sometimes none of them will have a dominant strategy, right? And so we got to check, okay? So let's start with low. Let's force Samsung to go low. If Samsung goes low, Apple either wants the $40 of profit or the $10 of profit. Now we got to remember that now the Apple numbers are on the right? They're the numbers that are not in the box, right? And so how does Apple get $40? They get $40 by setting their prices high. Now let's force Samsung to go high. If Samsung goes high, Apple is going to want the $90 in profit, right? And so you'll notice, if we look at that, if I can get my marker the right thickness, when Samsung went low, Apple went high, and when Samsung went high, Apple went low, right? That means that they don't have a dominant strategy, right? Apple is dependent on what Samsung does, right? And so they don't have a dominant strategy. They have no dominant strategy, right? Now, just because Apple doesn't have a dominant strategy does not mean that we cannot figure out what's going to happen. We can't figure out what's going to happen because we know that Samsung is going to go high no matter what. And when Samsung goes high, no matter what, I cover up the Samsung low numbers, and we know that when that happens, Apple is going to want the $90 of profit instead of the $50 of profit, right? And so what this ends up being is the result, right? When Samsung goes high, Apple goes low, and we call this result the Nash equilibrium. Named after famous basketball player Steve Nash. Just kidding, that's not true. Now, in this next example that we're going to look at an actual FRQ from the College Board. Okay, so let's do that. We have Red Shop and we have Blue Mart, and like I said, the first step is boxing out the numbers on the left. We box out these numbers on the left, right? Well, let's see here. This first question says, if Red Shop chooses a location of the south of the city, which location is better for Blue Mart? So if Red Shop goes south, that means that we need to cover up those options because we're forcing Red Shop to go south. And then we need to figure out what is best for Blue Mart, okay? So does Blue Mart want the $4,000 of profit or the $1,000 of profit? They're going to prefer the $4,000 of profit, right? And so Blue Mart will go north when Red Shop goes south, right? And when it says explain, they want you to explain using numbers, right? And so we would say Blue Mart will go to the north when Red Shop goes south because $4,000 of profit is greater than $1,000 of profit, right? So that would be an acceptable answer for College Board, okay? Now this next question. Is choosing a location to the south of the city a dominant strategy for Red Shop? Well, we have to check to see what are those dominant strategies for Red Shop. So let's say Blue Mart goes north. When Blue Mart goes north, Red Shop goes south. They want $5,000 of profit over $900 of profit. And then let's check when Blue Mart goes south. When Blue Mart goes south, Red Shop is going to want the $3,000 of profit instead of half of that, $1,500, right? And so would that be a dominant strategy? That's not a dominant strategy, right? Because they are dependent on what Blue Mart does. Sometimes they go south, sometimes they go north, right? So we would say, no, they do not have a dominant strategy, right? Because they are dependent on the actions of Blue Mart, okay? Now, here's another common type of question they'll ask you. They'll ask you, what will be the result if these two firms cooperate, right? Remember, we talked about how oligopolies, when they collude, they become a monopoly. It's illegal in America and Canada, Mexico as well, illegal a lot of places around the world. But let's say they do. Let's say that they illegally collude, forming a cartel. What will the result be, okay? Now, there's two possible answers here, right? We have this answer, which is the most profit, but sometimes my students will say, what about this answer, sir? This answer has a smaller profit differential, right? The difference between the two shops here are smaller, right? And I say, that profit differential is important, but would Blue Mart rather have $3,500 or would they rather have $4,000 of profit, right? They would rather have $4,000 of profit, even if Red Shop is making more than them, right? And so the best answer here would be Red Shop goes south and Blue Mart goes north. Finally, very common question. They try to trip you up by asking you to change this payoff matrix, this box here is called the payoff matrix. Okay, so assume the south suburb has enacted an incentive package to attract new businesses. Any firm that locates to the south of the city will receive a subsidy of $2,000 per day. Okay, so you get $2,000 more dollars in when you go south. And you got to remember what a subsidy is, right? A subsidy is the opposite of a tax. Instead of the government taking away your money, the government is paying you to do something, right? And so this is how I like to solve that problem, right? The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to make Red Shop go south. And when Red Shop goes south, they get $2,000 more of profit. And so what I have to do is I have to change the Red Shop numbers. The Red Shop numbers are the ones that are boxed out. So our 5,000 becomes 7,000, and our 1,500 becomes 3,500. Okay? Now, I am going to force Blue Mart to go south. And when I do that, I now need to change the Blue Mart numbers. I need to increase them by 2,000. And so 3,500 becomes 5,500. And 1,000 becomes 3,000. And so my answer for the AP test would literally be this question drawn out in my booklet with the new box and everything, right? Now, on this year's AP test, because they're not going to be having you draw anything, the most likely thing that they'll have you do is probably find a new Nash equilibrium or check to see if there's a new dominant strategy, which you will do in your assignment for today. Okay, so you'll do the same thing I just did, except with the extra step of finding a new Nash equilibrium and a new dominant strategy. All right, y'all. I'll see you live at 11 o'clock, unless I don't teach you and you're just watching this video on YouTube.